you're starting to reap some of those rewards from your early season laboring in the vegetable garden. Of all of our vegetable garden plants, tomato is the king and has always been. However, the tomato can be somewhat tricky to grow, especially in our Oklahoma crazy environment. Today we've got 6 common reasons why your tomato might look a little less than ideal. There's nothing worse than when you go to pick some of that ripening fruit and find that you've got some rot down on the bottom of it. This is known as blossom end rot, and like its name implies, it is a rot that starts down at the blossom end. So here it was attached to this stem, and this is where the flower originally was. Now we know that this is caused by a calcium deficiency. However, that doesn't mean that you should just go apply calcium, because it can be a result of many different factors, including the fact that if you planted your tomatoes early in the season before the soil temperatures reach 65, then those roots might not have actually been able to take up the calcium that may be existing in your soil. Another thing, I always talk about doing soil testing early in the season, and the reason why it's important to do that is to check your pH and also your nitrogen levels. If your pH is too high or you have too much nitrogen, then again, those will prevent the plant from being able to take up a lot of that calcium. Now, probably the biggest culprit for blossom end rot is inconsistent watering. You never want to let your plants get so dry that they're actually wilting. Calcium is water soluble, and if you don't water your plants, it can't take up any of that calcium. The other thing, as we get into those hot, dry, windy days, which we're known to have a few here in Oklahoma, your leaves will actually transpire more moisture than your fruit, which creates that deficit of calcium at the blossom end of your fruit. The other thing is, if you water too heavily, then that tends to cause some of those roots to die back, again, preventing those roots from taking up additional calcium. So just because blossom end rot is caused by calcium deficiency doesn't necessarily mean that you have a deficiency in your soil. There's only one cat face that we want to see in our garden, and that's Cowboy Kitty. However, all too often you might start seeing what's called cat face on your tomatoes. And this is when your tomatoes look somewhat distorted. They obviously have kind of this irregular shape, and usually you'll see a dark scarring and where it's kind of indented right there between healthy tissue. So it can take on a lot of different shapes, but you'll see where it's just overall distorted. Now, this doesn't actually necessarily affect the fruit. You can cut that out. It just overall makes it less marketable, and the aesthetics are less desirable. Now, what causes cat face on tomatoes is typically it is caused because of irregular blooming. So the blossoms are irregularly developed, which then makes the fruit irregularly developed. Another cause is oftentimes when you have phenoxy herbicides such as 2,4-D that have been sprayed in the area, that can cause cat facing as well. Often you'll see cat face more on your larger beefsteak heirloom varieties more so than some of the others. But this here is called cat face. Did you know that tomatoes actually need sun protection? No, not this sort of sun protection. I'm talking about the vegetation and the foliage that helps cover and protect our developing fruit from the sun exposure. Now, often tomatoes can actually get sunburned. Now, this is called sun scald when you start to see it appear on the tomatoes, and usually it starts to appear up around the shoulders of the fruit or on the exposed side. Usually, again, often it develops on the mature fruit as far as the size, but it still might be green or slightly pink. And as it starts to develop, you'll see kind of this whitish kind of blemish on that shoulder, and it'll continue to develop and worsen as the fruit develops. Now, one thing that you can do to protect your plant is obviously let some of that vegetation and foliage kind of cover your plants. However, this does tend to be more of a problem on staked tomatoes versus caged tomatoes, because staking, you often have more exposed fruit. The other thing is, if you are going to prune any of your tomatoes, make sure if you're having that exposed fruit that you do put up some sort of protection, maybe some burlap or some sort of shade cloth, especially on the west side, just to prevent sun scald on your tomatoes. Now the next thing that you might see that's affecting your plant is actually affecting the overall plant, not the fruit. And this is called physiological leaf roll. And as you can see, the name implies the leaves are actually rolling up. This tends to start on the lower part of the plant on the older leaves and work its way up. Now you won't see any yellowing with this. The plant should not have any yellowing. It should still continue to grow and have new growth and also be producing still. So otherwise the plant is relatively healthy, other than just the aesthetics of what might look like it's wilting, which might cause you to water it more than is needed. So this is just a phenomenon that happens. And there's not a lot that we can do about it. We tend to find that some varieties are more susceptible to it than others. And also tomatoes that tend to be staked and pruned tend to be a little more susceptible to it than some that are kind of sprawling about. Now another factor that can often cause this in tomatoes is extreme heat, prolonged periods of heat, and combination of wet periods can cause this as well. Other than that, you should still be getting a good fruit off of it. Just know that this is not a pathogen or a disease. Now another problem we often see on our tomatoes is cracking. And this is pretty common, and you can see it usually takes on two forms. A lot of times you'll see a vertical split that's happening from the stem down the shoulder of the fruit, or oftentimes it creates this concentric circle where it's kind of this radial cracking that happens. And it happens both on large and small fruit. It doesn't really matter which hybrids you have or which type of tomatoes you have. Usually it is caused by excessive amounts of moisture, whether that's irrigation or rainfall, that proceed after an excessive dry period. And a lot of times, even if your plant is on irrigation, if you have more ideal growing conditions, then that can cause it as well. So even though it's hot and dry right now, we've got these plants on irrigation. If we cool off, then that's going to allow this plant to want to grow more. And what's literally happening is that inside of that tomato is growing faster than the outside skin, causing that cracking to happen. Now really the only thing that you can do to prevent this is, as soon as you start to see tomatoes that are starting to turn pink, go ahead and harvest them and allow them to ripen indoors. Another problem that you might see on your tomatoes is, well, the fact that you might not be getting any tomatoes, and this is known as blossom drop. While tomatoes are warm season crops, we know that our summer temperatures can be beyond warm and in fact downright sweltering. If our summer temperatures, our daytime temperatures get above 90 degrees, this can cause your flower buds to drop, and excessive winds can also cause further problems with that. I mean, what days do we not have high temperatures and excessive winds? That's known as July and August around here in Oklahoma. But more than the daytime temperatures, looking at the nighttime temperatures, if they are anywhere outside of the range of 55 to 70 degrees, then this can also cause the pollen in these flowers to become non-viable. So if these flowers are there, but they actually aren't getting pollinated, then they're just going to abort and drop off, therefore not producing any fruit for you. While there are a few more heat-tolerant varieties on the market, other than that, there's very little that we can actually do to prevent blossom drop. Although one of the things you do want to be cautious of is not to put down excessive amount of nitrogen, as that only encourages more vegetation and also prevents flowering and pollination. Now the good news to all of this is, if you are able to maintain a healthy plant, as soon as our summer temperatures start to decline a little bit and we get back in that viable pollen range, you'll soon see your tomatoes start to produce fruit once again. So as you can see, it can be somewhat tricky growing that perfect red tomato. That's why it's so important to have done a soil test, know the problems that you might encounter going through the season, and also continue watering appropriately. We hope you enjoyed this video as part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on the OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.